Like, do you even know who you are? I am black, biggity black, American, yes, but bigger than that. Spitting opinions, rooted in facts. Hope you aware the culture is bigger than plats. Used to be a summit, now we got a podcast. Gave you something, you wouldn't know you want it. Black American podcast, Black American podcast. You might hear something.
Welcome to the third week of our Black America Summit 2. We have our first panel of the night called Pandemics, Patriarchy, and Parents in the Classroom. We'll be looking at the Black student experience during this pandemic. And the description for this panel is we speak with educators and reporters about the ways that the pandemic has impacted students' learning and the roles of parents in the educational experience. We'll also unpack how patriarchy, infantilization, and misogynoir shows up in the classroom environments in ways educators and parents and people in the community can combat those things. So I'm excited to have two amazing panelists here with me today. And I will start off with introducing Mr. Qu'Derrick R. Covington. Mr. Covington currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the Tulsa Speaks Consultant Firm, LLC, which provides interactive workshops, seminars, and keynote addresses. He's also founded in 2019 the Tulsa Initiative, Inc., a digital mentoring platform that uplifts and motivates while inspiring generations to liberate themselves to freedom while impacting and serving their communities. So I'm so excited to talk to you all about that, unpacking what you're doing and how that correlates with what students are experiencing in the classroom. And we have Dr. Valerie Adams Bass, who I saw just a moment ago, so I think she'll be right back. I promise you she's here. And Dr. Valerie is a developmental psychologist who earned her PhD in interdisciplinary studies and human development for the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. She focuses on adolescent development. Dr. Adams Bass is an assistant professor of youth and social innovations in the Department of Human Services at the University of Virginia Curry School of Education. I'm also really excited to have Dr. Adam Bass join us because her team pulled together this really incredible report at SCRD. And the report was called Addressing Inequalities in Education, Considerations for the Black Children and Youth in the Era of COVID-19. So she really literally unpacked the exact experience that children are experiencing right now throughout America. So hopefully she'll be back on screen in just a moment. How are you all doing today?
I'm well. Super excited to be here with you both.
Thank you. I think we're going to, hi.
Hi, I can't hear you.
Us today. Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
I cannot hear you. That's why I didn't realize you were here. Oh my goodness, it's not good.
Oh, maybe exit and come back. Let me take that. Oh yeah, or take that. Maybe without the headphones. Can you hear us now?
You're on mute, Doc. Dr. Bass, you're on mute.
It won't let me unmute. I'm gonna type it in the back to see if maybe she can exit and come back in. Okay, so while we get started, I will pass my first question to you, Mr. Covington, and that's our umbrella question. And our umbrella question is, how has the pandemic impacted the classroom experience for Black students? I know you work with students through your organization, so perhaps through that you might have heard some of the experiences that they've been having over the last year and a half.
Absolutely. And so I'm also, I work at Howard University. I'm in our Office of Retention, as well as wrapping up my doctorate degree at Howard University in education, higher education, leadership and policy studies, with a real focus on Black and brown males and their matriculation through their college experience. Now, as it relates to from an organizational perspective of how we do work and how we engage Black and brown males. Yeah, we can hear you, Dr. Bass.
But I can't hear you. I'm going to leave and come back.
Okay. And so for us, as it relates to our organization perspective, we were able to engage Black and brown students at a higher level of how they communicated, how we communicated. As you know, going through the pandemic, everything was kind of like fritzy. We didn't know what to expect or what was going to happen. And so there was a lot of thinking and thoughts like, hey, how would they respond? I think in our space, these Black and brown males were actually able to respond in a very pleasing manner. We've seen our engagement go up. We've seen our retention rate go up. And so while I guess and could be possibly on one hand, there has been some disadvantages, I think there have also been some advantages on the other hand.
Oh, okay. Well, Dr. Bass is coming back in. Can you talk perhaps a little bit about some of the advantages you've seen, and maybe we can go a little delve deeper when she's back?
Absolutely. So for those of you who don't know, I lead an organization called the Tulsa Initiative, which is a mentoring platform for Black and brown males 18 to 24. But it has a very unique focus on entrepreneurship, where we're focusing on and really showing Black and brown males how to become entrepreneurs. However, we use a curriculum that is based on best practices from business schools all across the nation. And so one of the things that we noticed and that we learned while going through and having the experience with our Black and brown males was that because they were not necessarily in school and they were actually at home, they were remote, they actually had more time to actually focus on their craft and on their business. And so every weekend they were very intensely working with our team and really focusing in on what it was that they were building. And so one of the survey questions that we asked them was, hey, do you feel that you would have been able to maintain the same level of focus in building your business and your product at the same rate if you had not went through this pandemic experience? And many of them said no. So I think, there is a side where I think for some, especially on a collegiate level, that it has possibly given them the opportunity, the space to actually kind of sit down, think, and focus in a manner that they may not have experienced before because everything was shut down.
Yeah. And I look forward to talking later a little bit about having these kind of mentorship programs and like the people who do have access to it right now, the benefits, and perhaps the need for having more resources like this. So Dr. Adams-Bass, so far I've just introduced you all, and I posed the first question, our umbrella question: how has the pandemic impacted the classroom experience for Black students? And so, and I said that you all wrote an amazing paper, so I'm really excited to hear your answer on this.
But thanks for having me, and apologies for the technical glitches. I'm like, I can see, hear all those things. But anyway, welcome.
Hey, it's a pandemic. Come on.
This is a perfect example of how the COVID-19 has affected Black students. Certainly, technology access. Not just Wi-Fi, but access to tablets, to computers was a huge challenge, particularly for those students who attend public schools who weren't already on a one-to-one, meaning they weren't already in schools and classroom where everyone was receiving a tablet or computer or an electronic learning device. So that was huge. Another issue with that was also the Wi-Fi connection, right? Whether or not students had Wi-Fi at home or a community hub. We've seen quite a few businesses like Comcast and others who have moved forward through the pandemic and offering community-based hubs so that people can get on the internet with a fast enough speed and to access the materials. That was big. We also know that because of the number of Black people who were either contracting or transitioning, dying from COVID-19. There was a lot of emotional stress and trauma associated. So it's hard to pay attention when you know that there are issues and challenges at home. Many Black families are multi-generational, and so you're doing your homework, and perhaps if you're a teenager, you're taking care of a younger sibling or cousin or someone else. So certainly there are multiple facets that were really impacting how Black children and youth were able to learn, right, in this COVID context.
And that makes a lot of sense. I actually pulled a few of the statistics from your report. One of which that I found was really interesting, that based off you all's study, you did a March survey that found that 1 in 4 Black youth connected with their teachers less than once a week, which seemed kind of astounding to me. What do you see like the impact being of having for some people having such small interactions with their educators?
So, we put together a brief, right? So I can't say that our brief was empirical at that point. We were gathering all the data from different places, what others were gathering, to say, here's what the stats show, and here's what we need to be keeping in mind while we're figuring out what to do with education and how to meet the needs of Black children and families. And so in terms of that communication, we know that whether you are in school or virtually, talking with, communicating, connecting with your teachers, your guidance counselors, your principals is so important. And so when you're in a virtual space where someone can't say, how are you doing? Can't check on you every day, can't tell you to, go down the hall or redirect you, or that person that you have an informal mentoring network at the school is not at home, right? And so it was important and continues to be important for teachers to reach out to students, right? And to figure out how to communicate in this digital space so that students aren't necessarily lost, and that teachers are also able to check in if there are some additional crises happening at home, versus just assuming that young people are home and disengaging from the learning environment because they're now at home. Certainly there are young people who are not thriving or haven't thrived in this academic setting, but we also know that there are young people who've done really well because they haven't had to deal with the emotional stress that comes along with learning in public school systems.
I think that you bring up quite a few really interesting points around that. Before I say anything, Mr. Covington, do you have anything to add to this, or any responses to anything that Dr. Adams-Bass said?
I don't. I think Dr. Adams-Bass knocked it out the park.
Yeah, like you really hit.
I mean, unfortunately, it's almost an exhaustive list. I mean, there's some strong bullet points that came out of our brief, and we're actually expanding that to a paper, but these are things that were pre-existent, right? We do know, unfortunately, in public schools, oftentimes Black teachers are not, Black parents may not get a call or a letter from a teacher unless something's wrong, right? How many times are there Black parents who will say, wow, your teacher called to say you're doing great, and so that really extended to this virtual space, right? Our teachers calling to check on students. So that is super, super important. And what we saw because of COVID-19 is how these disparities were just really exacerbated, and things that we need to attend to even now, where we're in this place of the American Recovery Act, where school districts are receiving quite a bit of additional funds to attempt to address any educational, slide or loss because of the digital learning environments. Are we rethinking how we connect with Black families and children?
As I was preparing for this panel and doing like my research, I found a really interesting tie between how we looked at working class Black families before the pandemic and how we look at them now. So before we looked at working class Black families, and also I will say a lot of those families are now essential workers, so they might not have the same flexibility of working from home as some other people who might not be in the working class. So it's been interesting reading about the stigmas that were already in place around the participation of parents and their position in society. And then now with the pandemic, this need for remote learning. or hybrid learning, and needing the parents to be able to do more than perhaps their jobs and time, the physics of time allows for them to have. So I think that that's something that was really interesting. And also reading the report, y'all brought up that 74% of Black youth said family finances were one of their main concerns or stressors during this pandemic. And I can only imagine how, especially if you are part of a working class family and you're thinking about the impact of a pandemic, your family being out there and also having to figure out hybrid learning or remote learning, the stress of that. Can you all, I think I started kind of testifying to it, but can you all talk a little bit around like the things that students are juggling right now, especially working class students? And this could be any age, it could be college students or, middle high school.
Sure. So I think I would say one of the things that we're seeing on our college campus, at Howard in particular, out of an array of things that has happened, now students have come back on campus this week to be exact. One of the things is, I would say students have come in with this mindset and mind frame of more of an independency than we had typically seen before the pandemic. I think, for college students being at home, and in particular, we're looking at our sophomore class students, our second year students who their first year of college was actually at home. And so now this is their first time actually on a physical college campus. They have come in very, very strong, from what we're sensing in the tempo on campus. Is one of them situations. Typically when freshmen come in, it's still like that nurturing stage where we're nurturing them through. And but this year, this cohort, 2 cohorts of students have come in very like, hey, we know what to do. We have been here. So I think that there has been on the
my sound just went out. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Okay, now I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, on the collegiate level, there has it appears though that there has been some real development and maturity wise and things that has happened within our college students that we're seeing thus far.
I think that's interesting, Mr. Covington. I'm excited to hear that. And so a few things I would say, sort of having experience. So one thing is that's unusual in the United States is the gap year, right? So we have to think about, there were some students who were able to thrive. Certainly there were challenges hands down for Black children and families, right? And definitely for working class families. And even there are some who are perhaps considered on paper middle class, but they were also considered essential workers, right? So they had to go to work. They had to be there. Think about nurses, think about doctors and things like that. And, assistants, physician assistants, and all those support staff were considered, essential workers, and they had to be there. So that meant that the children who were at home, whether they were high school graduates in their freshman year or whether they were K through 12 students, there was a lot more sort of adjustments at home and probably, I would say, responsibility that came with that. And so getting back to that point of seeing some level of maturity, at least initially in this first week, if you compare the experience, we typically traditionally, we graduate from high school, and those of us who go to college, we go straight to college. We have the on-campus experience. And like you said, there's some adjustment that needs to take place, some coaching in terms of maturity. But if you look at other countries, European countries, African countries, certainly I'm sure due to colonialization, but they have a gap year. And so those students don't go straight to college. They go and have lived experience, whether it's working, volunteering, just staying at home. They have a year to, one, take a mental break, but also mature a little bit more. So once they go off to college, they are a little bit more svelte, more mature, more responsible. So, and in some ways, what you're saying echoes what I know of and have experienced with students who have taken a gap year or who are international students and also having lived abroad, what that feels like and looks like for those students who are in that space. So I would say that probably is one of those lemonade moments that we've had through COVID-19. I was working with someone at NPR, and she was sharing with me the experience. They've been following a group of middle schoolers through high school, and there are a couple African-American males who were thriving at home. in ways that they were not thriving in the classroom. And, you know, they were able to speak to both the son, one of the young men, and his mother were able to speak to the emotional stress he carried with being an African-American male in the school where there were very many of them, and what it meant to always work against the stereotypes, right? And so being at home, he was less anxious, he was able to sleep better, he paid attention, his grades were soaring. And so the conversation we had, or they were having, was, and what will this be like when he's back in the classroom and there are assumptions about him, and that's how people are engaging. So we do have those young people who were doing better and thriving at home, and then we had those who just weren't. You know, connecting online was not their thing, and it could also have been many of the other variables that we've talked about and spoke about briefly. So, you know, I do think that, you know, there's going to be some students in this year of hybrid or full education, whether we're talking at the college level or K through 12, who are going to express a different type of student than they were before the pandemic. And the challenge of all of us educators, myself being one as well, is, are we able to adjust to this new student profile that we're going to have to manage?
Yeah. And you're bringing up a little bit of what I've been hearing from some of the professionals, the Black professionals who've been working at home, and saying they've enjoyed not having some of the microaggressions that they experience in the workplace. So perhaps our students are in some ways saying that they enjoy not having perhaps microaggressions or stereotypes being placed onto them, which I will let us delve into in just a second. But before we get into that, you brought up an interesting point of a gap year, and like that's not really common in the Black community. We don't tend to look like as fondly on people having, you know, a gap year. It's kind of like, if you're going to go to college, go straight, or get a trade, do whatever you're going to do. Do you think that this pandemic is going to shift like students' ideas around the gap year, or taking time off, taking it at their speed after they graduate?
Culturally, I would say no. I would say as a culture, we just, even in American culture, unless you happen to be from a privileged family, even non-Black children, don't take the gap year. We don't do it. We just don't do it. Our culture is graduate, go to college, graduate, go to technical school, graduate, go into the Army, graduate, go to work. Our that's not what our culture is, right? And particularly in the African American community, where we do still have to work twice as hard, sometimes 3 times as hard. Parents' concern is that if you don't go right away, you won't go at all, right?
Yeah.
Some young people, that could be true. We, you know, as parents, learn your children, like, this child, I know, needs to go. This child may need a little more maturity, but what we do know is that we want them to have that additional resource of attending college, because it's not just the academic experience, it's the social network that comes with attending college, right? So we're talking a lot about college, but there's also networks that come with, you know, going into the military. There's networks that come with these different next phases of life. So I do believe that where the financial stressors have become very real in this moment for Black families, working class, even middle class families, I think there will be some discussion around the gap year, but we probably need to broaden that discussion and look at it more favorably. That discussion may be more around the financial capacity to go right away versus, let's look at it as an opportunity to save money, to get some additional experiences, to reduce the burden on you or your family. That's definitely a part of the conversation, but let's also think about what else you can do during this year that you may need to sit out. And also, one thing that in another life, I was actually an admissions counselor. So one thing that I've been talking with high school parents about is, if your child is choosing to do a gap year or start part-time, they should still apply. If they're confident about where they want to attend, they should apply this year, or the year that they're next year pending, for those who are in 12th grade now. And if they're accepted, then write the college and say, can you hold my acceptance? Can you hold my scholarships? Because I think that's something we don't know, particularly those of us who come from a working class background and perhaps our first generation. We don't know to ask those questions. We don't know to, hold on to those resources. So you could say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and apply for this year when I graduate in 22, but I'm going to take a break. I'm going to work, or I'm going to do some other things. And then, I'm going to ask the college if they hold my acceptance. In some colleges, if they are really interested in you, they will hold your acceptance. And if they've offered you scholarships, they will hold it for you too. And that's different if you say, I'm going to apply early admissions and I'm going to, but in general, you can ask those questions and they can tell you no, or they can tell you yes.
Before we move into the second topic of the panel, patriarchy, I wanted to ask Mr. Covington, during this pandemic, is there anything that like juniors and seniors in high school can be thinking about to prepare for programs like yours, like during this pandemic?
So yes. Now I'm going to take a quick turn on the conversation because since you asked that question, one of the things that we have been, whether in K through 12 schools speaking, or even on a collegiate level, is also introducing our students, right, to other alternatives outside of just higher ed. When I grew up, we only had two options. It was either you went to the Army or you went to college. Trade school wasn't an option. It wasn't talked about. And God knows entrepreneurship was not even a thought to consider. And so one of the things that we have been pushing and been talking about is, hey, what are some of those other things, right? What happens when, you have an individual who don't want to go to college, but they're very artistic. They're very creative. They're into fashion. They're into designing. How are we creating space for these students so when they can, what if they decide our program is 18 to 24, focused around entrepreneurship. So they have a basic level of understanding about entrepreneurship. What does it mean? How do we help build community within our K through 12 grade schools, but also even on a collegiate level, because we still have the same challenges on collegiate level where some students, they may not do good in certain business classes, but they can run a business and are extremely well at it. So how do we balance that? How do we have these conversations and build community to actually talk about it, but then to also to support these students? So going back to the high schoolers, how are we helping them within the arena that they are in and saying, hey, there's nothing wrong if you do not want to go to college. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I love it. I totally love that answer. And again, this is probably colloquial. I do use colloquialisms when I'm here with the Black American Summit, so I'm going to go ahead and say it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I always say is I don't knock a hustle as long as it's legal, right? I want to come home to my bed. I don't want to be in a jail cell. I don't want that.
It's legal and it supports the community.
Right? But, I really believe that. And really, there, probably one or two, if not three generations we're working into now who have that disconnect from entrepreneurship, right? But if you think about, probably before all of us was born, including myself, when there had to be Black-owned businesses, right? And then they were passed on. My uncle was an entrepreneur, may he rest in peace. And now my cousin, his son is an entrepreneur, right? He didn't go to college. He did go to, he loves music. So he went to school to learn music, but what he's doing has nothing to do with music, but he does music. His job, the career he has, his company allows him to pursue that music career. But many of us, are just thinking college or having that conversation. Whereas before we could see Black-owned businesses in the community, we had entrepreneurs in our own family that we could pay attention to.
And so that how to have a business and the logistical sides of it, the operation side of it. Yeah.
So reintroducing entrepreneurship to the Black community, particularly younger people, I think is so awesome, right? I think it definitely needs to happen. Clearly, I'm a college graduate. I believe in college, but I also believe that there are other alternatives that are just as lucrative, right? There's skill sets with each arena, and we need to value them all because you may have a young person who's just going straight to the top. They just really have a good artistic concept, artistic eye, and so that's what they want to do and pursue. I don't know that we should discourage them from that. But because we have not been having conversations and they've not seen models of Black entrepreneurship, different models, right? Right now, you'll see all these virtual models, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to become a YouTube star. And now my family is being financed through YouTube. But there are other models of entrepreneurship, right, that don't necessarily rely on that. And so it is reintroducing that to Black youth.
And I like that programs like incubators and the Tulsa initiative that provide some structure and guidance for people who are like building businesses, because it can shoot up. And we've seen some like Instagram businesses that get really great orders and then they don't know how to fulfill those orders. And so then they have like the back end of things kind of falling apart.
Yeah.
And sometimes they have the capital, right? You know, you're here in your house or your cousin's house or even in school, right? And you figure out how to make something, but do you have the capacity to scale up? Do you have the knowledge? So on the other hand, that is where college can be helpful, right? So even if you decide that you're going to get a certificate or go to a community college to get the business, acumen to go along with the entrepreneurial skill, then there are those who have that entrepreneurial skill. They can think like a manager and they can bring all those resources together. But certainly there's access to all of those different elements. And many of us are going to have more than one career in our lifetime, including this newer generation. So knowing, and learning and being exposed to those different options, I think is key, particularly in this period where, what conversations that have been occurring is, do I go to college or do I get a job because my family has been economically stressed because of COVID-19?
Exactly.
It could be, do I become an entrepreneur, right? And how do I do that?
Go ahead.
And I was just going to say, I think Dr. Adam Bass made a great point. I cannot tell you from K through 12 school through college, master's, it wasn't really into my doctoral program that I actually start hearing about Black Wall Street, and the businesses that was there and what they were able to do in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
And so I think for a lot of times, because also we're not educated on what our ancestors had already done, when we hear it, it sounds like a thought that's unrealistic because we haven't seen anyone who has done it before.
Yeah.
And so I think, it is also, so important on the educational component, the K through 12 side, to make sure that we are having these conversations to show Black and brown students where they come from. Your ancestors were smart. They literally built multi-million-dollar businesses that will be today. They had their own schools, their own hospitals, they own private airplanes, their own restaurants, barbershops, you named it, they had it. But, it's one of those conversations and one of those points in history that oftentimes get lost, in translation when we're talking about Black and brown people in the educational arena.
Yeah.
It's erased. I'll let you go, Rielle, in a minute. I want to say it gets erased. One of my areas of research is the impact of Black history knowledge. And that's what you're talking about. Black history knowledge is absent from the K through 12 or K through 16 curricula unless you are majoring in Black studies, Africana studies, African American studies, or taking one or two of those courses. And so when you go into an entrepreneurial class, you're not going to necessarily learn about Black entrepreneurs then or now. You may hear a blip about one. You're not going to learn about the ingenuity of Black people and Black engineers, Black medical doctors. You're not going to learn about any of those things. So Black history matters across the spectrum. I was just doing a panel about, Black history and body image and how how that came up as important to, a strong body image concept. But we have to really work to integrate those of us who have the opportunity to work with young people formally and informally to integrate Black history knowledge because they're not getting it in our educational system. Really, Black history is American history. Everyone benefits, but Black people, Black children benefit more. It's not a part of our educational system as it should be. And so you have these gaps in knowledge that could instigate, if you will, an interest in areas. And we found that in one of the papers that we had accepted for publication, we found that those students, college and high school students who had higher Black history scores, they had higher educational and career objectives, right?
Yeah.
They wanted to do A, B, and C versus those who had lower Black history scores. So you're right, dead on with, we need to know. And that's why, oftentimes they don't know. And to make you chuckle before we move on, when the movie Black Panther came out, I teach a media stereotypes in Black adolescents undergraduate course. A student came to me, African American, and she said, no, Dr. Bass, I want to take your class and I might want to work as a research assistant with you. She said, I never knew about the Black Panthers until I saw the movie. And
wow.
we continued to talk, and she was saying, no, I didn't know about the Black Panther Party. Right. So she was at this point a sophomore in college and had never heard about the Black Panther Party. I'm sure they celebrate Black History Month in February, wherever she attended school, but had no idea about the Black Panther Party, People's Party.
And I will say, growing up, I was homeschooled quite a few different times in my my life, and my mother taught me a lot about like the about African American history, like true African American history, or even like teaching about Abraham Lincoln, that it really wasn't that he just wanted to free the slaves because that was what he had in his heart the whole time. It gave me a more nuanced understanding about like our history and the racial dynamics throughout history. Larry Lindsay actually asked a really interesting question before we moved on to the next segment of this panel. He said, how do we integrate and or assist individuals who have a legal history that hinders resources into college and university?
Oh, that's a great question. I love it. So one thing that I would do, what's starting to happen now, there are a few things. When you have a legal history, sometimes it prohibits you to access financial aid, right? So that's really the truth. If you have a legal history, particularly if it's associated with some federal charges, it prevents you from getting grants and other resources, right? So one thing I would say is still dig for scholarships if you have the acumen, because there are scholarships for left-handed people. And so I would say do that. The other thing is there are programs popping up. I can't say off the top of my head, but I can say that I've been reading about programs that are coming up that are becoming bridge programs for people who've been adjudicated or have a legal history or record, so that they can begin to take college courses and at a minimum get certification, which means that they'll be taking some college courses. So there are those two aspects. So I would definitely, investigate, Larry. I'm not sure where you are, what state, if there are any of those programs popping up in your area, because what they'll have is counselors and advocates to help you navigate and determine what's available to you or to the community you work with to access college. And then there are, community college programs that are a little bit more affordable, and you can, depending on what your financial situation is, you may be able to take some courses here and there. But I would definitely look, those programs are popping up. I've seen them, not a whole bunch, but I have seen them coming up here and there.
Awesome.
And I just wanted to add to that question, and I was looking it up as Dr. Bass was speaking. There's also a program called Parole to Pride.org, where they do some of the same thing that Dr. Bass was just speaking about, with actually trying to help individuals get partnered up, get certificates, go through school that has previously been incarcerated. So that's a very great program that we have been watching and just seeing the work that they are doing.
Yeah. And I see another question here. We'll never have enough time. But, how do we allow more real world experiences to count for credit? That's a great question too. So, this goes back to our early conversation. The traditional college pathway doesn't necessarily allow for real world credit the way we think of it. But colleges are more often requiring community service or civic engagement. So that may be a doorway for some level of credit. You may not get credit for all of your life experience, but it's worth asking, right? Because there are some young people who are fabulous. They come in, they've been doing work in their community, or they start to do work in their community, and they get college credit for it. So I think you need to investigate the requirements of civic engagement, service learning. There are different terms for it depending on the college, and you may be able to get some credit for life experience. The other thing is, if you're a mature person, you're returning to school, some programs do have credit for life experience. They'll say it's usually an accelerated degree. You're not typically going to have the traditional college experience, but they will, depending on what your work life experience has been, they will give you credit for that. You might have to write an essay or validate the experiences, really meet the requirements that they've set, but those options are there. They just don't necessarily elevate to the conversation because we're often talking about traditional 4-year college experiences versus a fast track program or a part-time student. So you're going to have to do some of the asking the questions and do some of the searching to say, here's what I'm looking for. Here's what I've discovered. Can we talk talk about it when you go to approach these colleges and other institutions.
Yeah, thank you for those resources. So we have a little bit of time. I would like to start to talk about gender dynamics in the classroom. And I know that our first week, we started bringing up patriarchy and how patriarchy kind of plays out in the classroom, or misogynoir. There's a lot of gender biases, or not even biases, myths that are out there. So I would like to start with talking about myths around the female or people who identify as female, and then go and talk about people who identify as children who identify as male. So first, I would like to talk about what does patriarchy or misogynoir kind of looks like in the school system or the classroom. This can be, I almost like giving you answers, but it could be literally any way you think of it. For me, the first thing I think of is policing the female body. And being very hyper vigilant about what female students wear. It can come up in it's to the point where people have been joking all these years you get police aren't what we wore and spaghetti straps, so now you can't talk to kids about wearing masks. The female body is so accessible to you all, but this thing that's actually protects us all from being sick, you're saying that you don't have the capacity to police that. So there are some biases that perhaps appear. So do you all have any thoughts on patriarchy or misogynoir and how they show up in a classroom or in schools?
That's a big question. We don't have enough time, so I'll give a short answer so Mr. Covington can answer. But the short answer is that Black males and females, Black children's bodies, as well as Black adults, but particularly in schools, Black children's bodies have consistently been policed. They've consistently been policed. And so, what that looks like and how it's expressed, there's some common ways that happens, but they're consistently policed and monitored by school personnel, teachers, administrators, non-teaching assistants. That's not new and common, and it's unfortunately a common experience.
Yeah.
I mean, even if we look at some of the things that make the news, one of the things that I seen not so long ago where a Black male had dreads and he was told that he couldn't walk across the stage for graduation unless he cut his dreads. When we looked at, wrestling matches in K through 12 school where another situation where a Black male was told that his hair was too long and he had to cut his hair in order for him to wrestle in a wrestling match. And so, to Dr. Bass' point, I think, Black and brown students have always been policed. And those are just two examples, right? Two examples of situations that has happened with Black males that has happened, in the 2020, 2021 timeframe, right? And so it just makes you wonder, how far have we really come that we're still having conversations around an individual not being able to graduate, a Black male not being able to walk the stage to graduate because he have dreadlocks.
Yeah. And I know when we're beginning, you were starting to say that some of your students were saying that they had a different experience being at home because they didn't experience some of those microaggressions or stereotypes within the school. Can you speak to some of those things that you've heard over the pandemic? That I know you focus on Black men, Mr. Covington. But.
For sure. So I think, just the pressure of having to show up and perform. So within our organization, we're serving Black men across PWIs, PBIs, HBCUs, as well as some Black men who decided not to continue on the higher education route. But whatever space that they are in, one of the common things that we heard is that, hey, they were free, they were at home, they could be them. And I think so many times as Black and brown people, we have to code switch when we go into certain environments, and we have to fit within a certain culture or a certain norm that people want us to fit in. However, if you're home for a whole year, year and a half, you're free. You get to do you. You get to be you. And so a lot of our conversations when we were talking about businesses and how they have been able to focus, it was as if it was a safety space that they had a chance to really kind of just debrief, for back a little words, let their hair down and kind of just be them and express themselves without being judged.
Yeah. So affinity groups, pretty much what he's saying, are so important, particularly at PWIs where you are isolated quite often and one of few in a classroom. I would say, I have a colleague, Dr. Sharita Butler Barnes. She does extensive research around sort of misogynoir and how Black girls are policed academically as well as physically. And, she's created quite a few programs and interventions that are attempting to provide them with the social emotional support so that they can thrive academically, that's not the challenge for them. So I would say to look up her work. She's doing some great things. I would also say, I would be remiss not to say that media has such an impact on how people, teachers, adults interpret the behavior, appearance of Black children and youth. Black children and youth sometimes tend to mature relatively fast compared to their peers. And so their physical appearance is interpreted as if they're adults when they're really still growing. And sometimes they're young children. I think about my own daughter who was short for a long time. Now she's tall. And I consistently remind people, she's 5. She just turned 5, so this assumption and treatment of children and youth as if they're adults, right? And then we also know that Black men and women adults have challenges with microaggressions, which aren't always microaggressions. We use that term, but sometimes they're just aggressive. It's just aggressive racialized behavior that we have to engage with.
Yeah.
But certainly, you see a video, you see someone, I think there were some of the things in prepping, like you see a Cardi B where people are celebrating her, ability to be who she is. But then for some adults who see that and don't really interact with the Black community and don't interact with other Black children or families outside of school, they're going to interpret that behavior as the norm for all Black women, and then that's going to translate to Black girls, right? So there's not a distinction between Cardi B as a woman and these high school, which is who I tend to study, adolescent girls, or these high school adolescent boys. And it isn't to say that those young people don't listen to that music and play or do the dancing that they see, but it's a conversation, right? And it isn't who they are all the time. But if that's how you're engaging with them, you're really doing them a disservice. Right, because they're children, they're young adults, they're growing, and sometimes they're not even young adults yet. But you're treating them as if they're full-grown, mature adults with the same cognitive processing ability, which isn't necessarily so.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of great points, including so before I go into one of the points that you brought up, I want to mention I just dropped a resource in the chat, which is from Girls for Gender Equity, and they put out a policy brief, school policing disparities for Black girls, and they look, and it's focused in New York, and they look at police being called on Black girls, and also they compare it to Black boys, and across race as well. And I know we won't get into that today. Maybe we'll have another panel in the future, but I want to let people know what I was dropping into the chat so that they can look at that in their own time. You brought up at the very end the school board that had Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion. I tried to share my screen, but couldn't. And it had like WAP, wear a mask, please. And it had like Megan, germs coming out her mouth, and then Cardi B with her tongue out saying, "Don't let coronavirus germs touch that little dangly thing that swings in the back of your throat." And so this is the sexualization and bringing in the hypersexualized songs, the music, into the classroom experience. There were a lot of debates online whether this would be appropriate if it was a college class versus a high school or middle school class. Sexualizing women and Black girls is not appropriate, in my opinion, in any grade, and especially in this picture there also, it looks topless in this bulletin board. I'm sorry I can't share my screen, but I think it's pretty it's gone viral, so you might be able to search the WAP school bulletin board to see what that looks like.
Context matters. You know, I want to go back to media is so pervasive right now because it's everywhere. It's on our watch, our smartphone, it's shrink wrapping a bus. It's everywhere. It's at the gas station, it's at the supermarket. And right now, what's different for this generation is that Black artists are mainstream artists, whereas before there were Black artists who might have mainstream top 40, but many of the, you know, artists who are mainstream are Black. And that means that much of what we consider Black culture, the diasporic culture, is, you know, on this platform without the context to interpret. And depending on who you ask, some people would say, oh, it's not a big deal. Others would say this is very problematic because it translates or transfers to day-to-day interactions. I would agree with that, you know, that for some, when that is your only representation, that is how you are understanding the world, right? You're understanding how people behave, engage, act, and that becomes your belief. It endorses stereotypes about Black women that already exist, over sexualized stereotypes. So I think context matters, but one of the challenges, and I just recently wrote a chapter about this, is that I think it's important for schools to be aware of the music that students are listening to, but it's equally important to have a critical conversation with your peers as well as with those young people around what's appropriate in this context.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was teaching my students Body by Meg. I played it at the beginning of class. They were so excited. But, you know, there's a conversation, particularly in high school or middle school, that you need to have in an awareness and knowledge base to help you decide what is appropriate and what isn't about that cultural expression to bring into your classroom, right?
Yeah.
So just because the young people are listening to it, and I can see a school saying we're trying to connect with them, and this is what
it was the biggest song last year. You know, why not?
But yeah, context, you know, it can be offensive and inappropriate, and so that's where context matters. And for those administrators and teachers who are at school, they have to do more than understand what the hottest song is. Right? They have to get a little bit closer to the culture, understand it, have critical conversations, listen, and then make the choice about what would and wouldn't be appropriate. And that doesn't happen often enough. They rip from that mainstream culture and say, "Ta-da! I can align with you. I understand you," right. But that isn't necessarily representing who these young people are.
Yeah. I know we could talk a lot longer about all of this, so I'm sure we're going to have to do another panel just on patriarchy, misogynoir, and gender identities within the classroom at some point. I would like to give you all a couple moments, like, to say any last words that you might have been thinking about in this panel that you haven't gotten to say, or if you have any last comments about, like, the programs that you have or books that people can check out to follow you and read what you're doing. This would be a great time to share that with us.
I think given the panel, there are two books that are really, you know, multiple chapters. I'm an author in one of them, but they're really geared toward teachers, and one is geared toward parents and teachers. So there's Strong Black Girls. It's a small book, but it's an awesome book with chapters. There's even the last chapter is by a 6th grade girl. I'm talking about everything from hair to what it's like to discover your culture, to sexuality. There's 2 other books for teachers. One is Teaching Brilliant Black Girls, right? And a guide for white teachers who teach Black boys. All practical. All of those are practical books, relatively reasonably priced. They may have electronic versions. They may be accessible right now during COVID-19 freely. I'm not certain. But I do feel like those are books that really get at the heart beyond just our normal research statistics that we share as researchers. They combine the research with the practice to say, hey, this is what this looks like in schools. This is what this looks like at work. This is what this looks like in these spaces. And here's what you can do, or here's what's needed to shift the narrative. So I want to encourage people to take a look at those books as spaces to understand and get a better handle on what's going on.
Can you, if you don't mind, can you type the book names in the
sure will. Please? I'm going to do that right now.
Thank you. Mr. Covington?
Yes, I would say one of the first books that comes to my mind is Advancing Black Male Student Success from preschool through PhD by Sean Harper. And it really does a great job of talking about, how we, first of all, understanding how Black males learn their type of environment, but then also how do we create an environment to actually help Black and brown males succeed. And then the next one will be Permission to Dream by Chris Gardner, because I think a lot of times when we're dealing with students, when they come to us, whether it's in grade school or in higher education, many times they have different traumas that they have experienced up to that point, and many of those traumas are limit them on how they see themselves, on how they see their outcome, and how they see their life. And so really just breaking down some boundaries and creating an open space to say, hey, listen, you're more than what happened to you. You can be whatever it is that you put your mind to and whatever it is that you desire to be.
I like that. I will also ask you, can you drop that book or the book name in the chat for the audience? I'm just gonna.
Yeah, I'm not able to send comments. I put them in the chat.
Jay? Oh, let me see. It should say the one that says comments. So I'm just putting in there for you.
Okay, awesome.
And I just want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions from the audience before I respect your time and let you all go. I think we answered all of them. I want to tell you all thank you so much for joining us and sharing the expertise that you all have. I know that you all are coming from this perspective from two different lenses, or coming to this topic from two different lenses and two different perspectives. And I think that y'all gave us a great umbrella kind of view of these topics and the conversations around the Black student experience during the pandemic, and starting the conversation around patriarchy, misogynoir, and gender identities in the classroom. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next panel will be beginning in just a couple minutes, and it's actually focusing on the educator's experience. So we just focused on the student's experience. Our panelists are here. They are ready to talk to you all. So we'll just give them just one moment. Thank you again, Mr. Covington and Dr. Adams-Bass, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have
Likewise.
a great moment. Take care, everyone. Be safe, dance, laugh every day. Stay healthy.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Just one more moment.